So we're really trying to take care of that last objective, examine the patterns and features that reveal a history of a species. There are 3 definitions that we have to do, and then kind of use examples of those and try and use logic to determine if things are related to each other or not. It's kind of weird initially, and it will be confusing initially, but homologous structures, analogous structures, vestigial structures are all slightly different from each other, and only some of these will be useful to determine relationships between organisms. So a homologous structure is technically when you have similar structures in different organisms that may have different functions. That may not mean anything to you right now, but I can give you some examples and it will make a little bit more sense. And what this ends up turning into on like a quiz or a test is I will give you some examples, and I should probably open that up here. So insert page. But if I put some examples up here, let's say we have a and you got to think about it for a second. But 2 of those 3 things are more closely related, right? You can group 2 of them together and leave the 3rd one out. But which 2 go together? So think about that for a second. But you have to have evidence, like structural evidence. Why would you think that this thing is related to that? And you have to use logic, and you have to be careful, because there are things that are curveballs that will try and throw you off. It is actually a little bit difficult to do this.
Yeah, exactly.
But out of a bird and a bat and a human, you're supposed to be able to tell which 2 would be most closely related, and you have to have a reason why. Had a little bit of think time, and it's okay to be wrong.
Well,
Some of these I don't really know the answer to. I just make them up as I go, like examples wise. This one I know the answer to, but sometimes I'm not really sure, and then it just turns into whatever. But Josie, any idea which 2 are most closely related? Bat, yeah. The bat was a good choice because it's definitely in the group. Bat and the human? Why? Mammals have a lot of things in common, right? And they're not superficial things. They have hair. They have live birth, right? They feed their young with milk. None of which birds do, right? So that is actually a very good thing to be looking at. What was the curveball, obviously, guys? Probably the wings that somebody said. Just because 2 things have wings does not necessarily mean that they inherited that from a common ancestor. That does mean that they have followed similar lines as far as evolution is concerned. They needed the same solution to a similar problem. They both needed to fly to get more food, to get more resources. But it does not mean that they're related to each other necessarily. Wings are not going to be homologous structures for us. That is actually something that you're supposed to ignore. It's a superficial characteristic that both of them share. And that's what makes these ones hard, these questions hard. Is I always give you something that's going to be a curveball in with the other stuff. I picked bats and birds for a reason. I wanted you to think about wings. But then I wanted you to ignore those things. The first thing that pops into your head is usually going to be the wrong thing in this context. And I did that intentionally to make you actually think a little bit harder to figure out if you can come up with something that's homologous.
So for the bat, aren't the wings more just extended fingers that are webbed?
So one of the things you could look at with those wings, right? Bats actually have very similar bone structure to you as far as the arm is concerned. Not perfectly similar, But this part of the arm is just a lot shorter, right? Their fingers, like 3 of them, are super extended and have webbing in between them. The other 2 are kind of pincers on top that they can grab onto stuff with. But they basically have the same bone structure as you, the same number of bones in the same relative position. Whereas birds, if you looked at a chicken wing, it's similar to your arm too. It has like the 2 bones that rotate over each other, right? That's part of the wing that you eat at Buffalo Wild Wings if you get the bone in. And then the other part of the wing is actually just 1 bone. That would be more like your bicep. Right? But then you have their hand is nothing like yours. They don't even have a hand. There's just a few nubs of a bone that are maybe there, but they don't have a hand. Whereas the bat technically has a hand, it's just not used the same way yours is, right? So we both have fingers, the same number of fingers and everything. That's what actually we're talking about here when we talk similar structures, different functions. Your fingers are used to grasp things, to manipulate objects. Their fingers are used to fly. Whole different use, obviously. Completely different function. But those are homologous structures. Yes.
Are you supposed to draw that diagram?
You want some examples. So if you're going to, right, for this one for sure, make sure you have yourself versus a bat. But I'd be talking about your hand, their wing, right? Right, so there are homologous structures. There are similar structures there that have completely different functions. But because the underlying structure is similar, that actually does indicate that you have some common ancestry, that you would probably have a more recent common ancestry with a bat than with a bird. All 3 of us would be related somewhat, but this is about trying to indicate ancestry, trying to figure out, do they have common ancestors or not? So if you find something that's homologous, that would indicate that they have shared ancestry, that they are closely related, versus, the bird that's technically related to us too, but very distantly. Right, so that's a good example. But again, all the things that go with the mammal are a good example too. The hair actually does distinguish us, right? The milk, the live young, not laying eggs, that kind of stuff. Definitely a good thing to separate us, right? But you would not want to use wings. Wings are actually going to be a analogous example. Analogous structures are the curveballs. They perform similar functions, but they are not similar in origin, meaning they did not come from the same ancestor. They didn't inherit that from a common ancestor. So this, where you had your hand in a bat wing, here you have the wings of birds and bats, right? And those structures are technically analogous, right? These 2 wings are analogous because they may actually have a similar function. They're both used to fly, but there is not much chance that they were inherited from a common ancestor. They don't have the same underlying structures, right? Birds don't have hair. They have what that distinguishes them? The feathers, and that's a really big difference right away, right? Plus the bone structure is a little bit different. Remember, the bird doesn't have the hand like you at all. They do have the rest of the bones that you have, which indicates that they are related to you, but they don't have the hand structure, which makes a big difference.
Couldn't one of these be the case for turtles and tortoises too? Like how one of them has fingers and the other has legs.
But they would still, you'd think that they're related, because if you look the underlying, they might have the same bone structure. And the shell is pretty similar, right? There's no way that happens by accident twice in 2 different species. They are likely related to each other that way. And they have a different kind of shell than all other things that have shell. That was actually a weird picture that I saw not that long ago on something online. They had a fossil of a turtle, and it showed you how the spine is connected to the shell. You can't take a shell off a turtle. If you think you can, it doesn't work that way. Right? On cartoons, they just slip them right off, right? The shell is like part of their skeletal system.
It's like hollow.
So it's really weird to look at when you see it like from a cross section. And just surprises you when you look at it the first time. But they are similar in function here again, but they are not similar in origin. And the not similar in origin means that that similarity is not due to having a common ancestor. It means that they're not really related, right? Maybe that's a better word to use there. I was just being fancy, right? This means that they're related. This means that they're not, right? Or at least not closely related. Not for that reason. Again, these get confusing sometimes because I can throw in extra stuff too, and it just makes it even weirder. What if we looked at those three things? What am I obviously trying to get you to avoid? No, but what's the analogous structure that all of them share? A wing. But none of them got those wings from common ancestors, but two of those things are more closely related than the other, right? Which two out of those three would be most closely related?
Bird and the bat.
But why the bird and the bat now?
Because the moth is an insect.
So what's the
Because
difference?
The birds
Well,
that have
the
bones.
moth has a completely different.
The bones, period, right? Having any bones at all would be a pretty big difference, right? So even though their bone structures are not at all similar, I could actually talk about some similarities between these two things and exclude the moth because they have bones, whereas that's an insect that has an exoskeleton, right? Completely different from the get-go right there. Plus, you can look at other things, right? These two have like 4 limbs, right? Arms and legs. That thing probably has 6, being a insect, right? A little bit different. So it's not to say that these two things can't be grouped together, but they have to be grouped together for a different reason. It can't be wings ever, right? So you have to be able to exclude things that seem obvious and don't necessarily mean anything at all. We were doing these examples in the other class, and these blew all of our minds, right? So this one's fun. Because I don't actually know the answer to this one. I can make arguments for a lot of different directions. Let's see how many arguments you can come up with that are actually homologous, that could be homologous. Say it's a snake, our turtle friend, and a crocodile. Which two would you assume are most closely related and why? Nothing superficial.
Oh, I got it. Turtle and croc.
Why?
Because they got they're in the water.
Snakes are in the water.
They're all reptiles.
They made it like keratin.
What?
I would say snakes and turtles because turtles and snakes don't have as much like teeth as a crocodile.
I would say that
Well-
one of those things.
Is the turtle shell made of keratin? Outside of the
Don't
turtle.
know. And that's where a lot of the trouble comes from. I don't know enough about these things to know the right answer, but I can make good arguments still.
Well,
Some of us were on the right
the
track.
turtle
We
and
just gotta.
crocodile both have tails, structure, and
I would not do tails. They definitely all have tails.
Okay,
This thing
how
is
about-
basically a tail,
How about
right?
this? Snake and croc, right? They both got like protective scales.
Snakes have bones.
But this has a
Scales.
protective scale, right? Kind of a different version of that, extreme version of that, but
Snakes and crocodiles,
turtles
turtles are evil.
that would be the one that I would jump to first, probably. And that's not even necessarily analogous. It could be homologous. If you look at underlying structures, they have similar bone structure. They have 4 legs,
So
right?
you can use
And-
legs as not a superficial thing?
That's not necessarily superficial. But then somebody who knows a lot about snakes would actually tell you that they do actually have leg bones. They just don't have legs. They have hips and like little nubs of leg bones. They're just inside of the body still, and they're not So they do kinda have legs, but they have the remnants of legs, which is something we'll talk about later.
Snakes and crocs are both predators.
Yeah, so are snapping turtles.
Wait,
Yeah.
snake.
There's one more thing that I was thinking about earlier that somebody already said something about it. Right? What does this guy have that this guy doesn't have?
Teeth.
I'm pretty sure that there are snakes with teeth. Not all snakes have teeth, right? But do any turtles have teeth?
Yes.
They have kind of like a beak that's really sharp,
You guys seen TMNT?
but I don't think they actually have teeth.
They have little
And
teeth.
maybe if I knew more about turtles, I'd know that yes, there is this species that has
I
teeth.
didn't mean like
Teeth. But
teeth per se on a snake. I meant like
if you were gonna do those two together, which is actually reasonable, and I don't actually know if this is which one's supposed to be more closely related to the other. But if you were gonna do these two, I would definitely be talking about something like teeth, because turtles do not have teeth, right? That I know of. I'm pretty sure they don't.
Can you look
They have like very sharp
If you look it
beaks,
up, it's
which means I can throw in one more example up here too. Chicken's supposed to be related to these things, right?
What?
they all taste like chicken.
Not super closely related, but chickens, all birds are ancestors. Their ancestors, we think, were
Chicken and
dinosaurs,
turtles both
actually.
have beaks.
But then you kind of think, well, maybe these two have beaks, and we could put them together, you know, kind of like a beak.
Don't both like new snakes and crocodiles? Don't they have like a second eyelid? Like they have.
I think that is actually true for
Sure.
some reptiles, but I don't actually know if turtles don't have that. They might have something like
I
that.
think sea turtles do.
But anyway,
I don't
know.
again, it depends on how you look at things. If you're trying to avoid curveballs, if you're thinking hard about it, that's good. If you're just looking at it and there's something obvious and you take that and run with it, that's usually not a good idea, right? So I'm not saying that there's a right answer here and I'm not going to worry about it because I still wouldn't group turtles and chickens together because I know birds are not closely related to other things that are still reptiles, right? They may have ancestors that were reptiles, but that does not make them closely related to any of those three things. I would definitely probably group some of these things together somehow. I just don't know why or what the right answer is.
Would you
The chicken with the
Would you do- would you do the chicken and the crocodile because they both have like talons on their?
Because like the talon-like claws that they have, right? Then you'd be going here and here, and you'd just be confusing us even more.
Look up
So,
pictures of Pokemon.
again-
I'm sure we'll find something.
I will give you a one that I'm pretty sure I know the answer to, but that doesn't mean that you're gonna know, right? And I want you to be thinking harder though. There is one thing that I will definitely put in there that is a very, very superficial structure, superficial similarity, and whatever it is that's the most obvious, that's the only thing that I'm gonna take off points for if you answer it that way. Does that make sense? I mean, I know it sucks because you may not know enough information to be able to tell me in all these cases, but we don't know all the information here either, and you can still make logical arguments like the teeth or maybe the legs or as long as you're explaining that, because again, remember the chicken has bones like you, but its fingers are non-existent, and the snake has leg bones, but the feet would be non-existent in that case, right? So I guess that really does make you think maybe crocodiles, turtles, more closely related. But then if you start thinking about teeth, then you're like, oh, well, that's a whole different thing that would be also, who knows?
If you put like a salamander on that one over there, it would be more related to a snake.
Probably. Yeah, I know that's true.
It says that prehistoric turtles had teeth, but no modern turtles.
Oh, some did, huh? And I was gonna say, I don't think they do now.
No, not now.
Next thing, aside from the curveballs that you gotta avoid and the ones that should indicate ancestry, some of the structures that we've talked about already are technically vestigial. So, the vestigial structures are supposed to indicate relationships again. They're actually types of homologous structures. They are things that are underlying that their only reason you have them in common is maybe you have inherited them from a common ancestor. So what we're looking for are things that aren't really used the same way anymore. They no longer have the same function. They're remnants of what they once were. We've already written one of those things up on the board. Which one of these had just remnants of something that the other two had?
Leg, bro.
So we can still assume that snakes are related to crocodiles and to turtles, and that they probably do have common ancestors because the legs are there. They just don't use them anymore. Right? They have the bones, the start of what could be legs. They just don't use them anymore. Now, do we really know if something with the legs came first and then it just lost its legs, turned into this, or maybe it started out like this and then got legs, and some of them have like the in between that almost has legs but not quite yet? But no, we don't know. But it's still one of those situations where this would indicate that it's related to these things, even though you wouldn't think so right off the bat. And you guys probably knew that snakes are related to the two others for other reasons. You've studied a lot of different things before. You've learned a lot of different things before now. You probably knew that snakes were considered reptiles, part of that group. So you would consider them. But that remnant, those leg bones that aren't really used the same way anymore, those are vestigial structures. So again, I'd use the green highlighter again for both homologous and homologous vestigial. Those do indicate that things are related. They may not be closely related, but they're still related. But again, I avoided the legs. I could still use legs to explain why these two are more closely related than to the other one, because they both have fully developed legs that are used and have similar bone structures possibly. Whereas the snake only has the remnants of those, which may still be related to the other two, just not as closely anymore. There are lots of different examples of vestigial structures because that's just one. Any others that you can think of? You have a few vestigial structures in your body as we speak. Or maybe you don't because it got removed, but that would only be for a few of us maybe. Maybe Tucker, is that what somebody told me? Yeah, somebody lopped your appendix out, right?
Yeah.
Tonsils,
He almost died. Sold it down in Mexico.
tonsils are technically kind of different because tonsils, losing your tonsils is kind of like losing one of your kidneys. You have more than one lymph node in your body that can be used for the purpose of helping you recover from sickness. Now, some people have trouble with their tonsils. They get inflamed and they stay that way, and then you have trouble. Yeah. So you get them removed, but you also have other lymph nodes in your body that can still take over the job for that. Right? So it's kind of like removing a kidney. You still have one. You need them. You need lymph nodes. But this thing, we're still not sure what it's for, right? Which is why we would just cut it out of Tucker if it's giving him problems. You do not just automatically cut them out of people, though, because there are statistics that have told us that when you do not have an appendix, it may actually hurt your immune system a little bit. We're not even sure why, but it tends to hurt your immune system when you lose it. We have no idea what function it would have in your immune system, but as long as Evan still has his, it might actually be helping him some way, somehow. We just don't know what it does. Right, but we do think that that is a vestigial structure because it doesn't have a main function in your body. Right? It could be similar to structures that you find in like a tiger. Their stomachs are different than yours, and they have special structures intended for eating, like that raw meat, right? Storing the bacteria needed to do that. So they may have a form or function, we just have no idea what it is. No, that's not, you're cutting its legs off instead of just it was born with just the remnants of the leg, right? That's a completely different thing. So you have appendix, you actually technically have some in here too, right? Some of us do, some of us don't. But I had to get 4 of them removed. Some of you may not even have any. Right? Wisdom teeth are considered vestigial structures now because not everybody has those extra molars. That would have been useful when you were a hunter-gatherer and you didn't have a dentist and you lost teeth every once in a while, so you needed another one to come in. Just like a shark needs rows of teeth to replace the ones that are lost. But it's not necessarily useful to our species anymore, so some people don't even have them anymore. right? It's a remnant of something that was once functional or useful. You also see vestigial structures in certain birds, right? Can you guess which ones? What do you think when you think birds?
Oh, flying.
You think flying. Do all birds fly?
Ostriches.
Penguins, ostriches, that weird
Chicken.
thing that was on the Galapagos video that just swam around and its wings are like puny and worthless, right? It can't actually fly. But it still has wings, so it might have a common ancestor with an eagle, with a pigeon, with a robin, with all those different things, right? You would still assume that all birds are related because they all have wings, and they have similar structures underlying in those wings. But is the wing big enough to do anything? Maybe not if it weighs 400 pounds like an ostrich does, right? Those same wings on Calvin would probably fly just fine, but they don't work so well for
I would use them to swim. What are you talking about?
You probably would. But anyway, it's inherited remnants, so you can put examples in there. It'd be like a penguin, ostrich wing. It'd be like your appendix, your wisdom teeth. It'd be like the legs for a snake. So put in some examples for your vestigial structures. Nobody has their pencil out. You need some examples for these so you can remember later. Write down a couple, like your appendix. Maybe ostrich wing. So write something in here. Don't just leave it blank.
Aren't ostrich wings just for like balance?
At this point, yeah. They flap them, but it's mostly just balance. Yeah.
I was aware of.
So again, I use this as part of learning what you were supposed to learn anyway. So you guys already know which two things are most closely related. This is a question in your notes. So yes, you do need that in here at some point. Which two things are most closely related? The humans, bats, moths. We should still know. It's the same as it was 5 minutes ago.
It's about human.
Bat and the human, why?
Because they're mammals.
Because they're mammals? So you pick out specific homologous structures like the fur, right, or hair, depending on what context you're talking about. The fingers and your hand, the bat wing, those are homologous structures. You have to say some kind of homologous structure. Whereas the wings for bats and moths, this is actually different because I threw in the moth. I didn't see that it was bird or moth instead of bird, but it doesn't matter. It's the same thing, right? We added that in too. So make sure you have reasoning. Make sure you try to. Right? And which two kinds of structures? There's only three kinds of structures I might be talking about. Homologous, analogous, or vestigial. Which two indicate ancestry?
Homologous and vestigial.
Because you would have a common ancestor, right? You inherit those from a common ancestor, although they might not be used the same way anymore. Again, the bird wing in your hands are way different, or the bat wing in your hands are way different technically, but they do seem similar enough that they could be inherited from a common ancestor. As far as vestigial is concerned, that snake and a turtle are probably closely related. And you can even see the remnants of legs. It's not that they couldn't have had legs at some point. They just don't use them anymore. So you should have everything you need. Really